Thank you for watching. This is Jim Hogue. And again, this is the House at Pooh Corner. And again, we are talking about sovereignty. We've spoken about that quite a bit in terms of monetary sovereignty, and it's the sovereign who creates the money. But we're going to be going a little bit deeper and wider, I think, today in terms of sovereignty. And our guests are, again, John Root and Emily Peyton. And I'm going to give an introduction that may be difficult to wrap your head around, as people say. I'm going to go back to the time of the American Revolution and talk about the way people thought and paradigm shifts in the way people thought and how that has morphed into what it has morphed into today. So hang on. And this might be a little bit wonky, but let's see what happens. So I'm saying that there was a great paradigm shift at the time of the American Revolution, John Locke and the whole philosophy of sovereignty and the right to exist. Then there was another paradigm shift during the Civil War. In the US, it had to do with a nation rather than a collection of states. The singular became the United States rather than the plural. So people thought of the United States as individual states. But after the Civil War, the term was changed, and very carefully the papers, the media, began to speak about the United States as it rather than they, or she, as often countries are referred to. So anyway, that was another big shift of thought. Then I'm jumping to World War I and the creation of the Federal Reserve, which was another quantum leap in terms of the way people thought. And we have evidence that it was people like Carnegie and the Carnegie Foundation who tried to set about deliberately changing the way people think, that they thought of the United States as one thing up until that period of time. And Dale Carnegie and his heads figured out a way to make sure that people changed their whole way of thinking. And in the documents, I'm not making this up, in the documents they found out that the only way to do that was war. So one of the reasons for creating a war was to change the way that people think. Now that's a mouthful, but if you just look at 9/11 and the way the media got behind that effort and the change of thought pattern in the United States, the national security state became okay. In Congress, it was just fine, but it was never fine before that. So what I'm getting at is that paradigm shifts and the way people think sometimes change because the world is changing. And events just sort of happen and people begin to think differently. But we have documentary evidence that there were people which can be called the secret elite, they can be called the deep state. They certainly exist. We found that out during the assassination of JFK, RFK, and Martin Luther King, the way that the judiciary just shut down. This is all because people were so stupid that they bought in to a gigantic lie. So I trust if you're watching this, you aren't one of those people, but that's the way they set about changing the way people think. These are paradigm shifts. Now, some of that turned out to be pretty good, and I wrote down a quick list before I left. After World War II, for example, the civil rights movement began to pick up, and the welfare state, the concept of taking care of people who needed to be taken care of, picked up. Affirmative action, equal pay, free speech, democracy, inclusion, personal sovereignty. These were things that were supposedly good and that the nation was proud of. And it involved a completely new way of thinking, that really all people are equal, not just white people from a certain place are equal to other people, but all people are equal. That began perhaps during the Civil War, but it became law during the Civil Rights Movement. And then I'm jumping around really fast here, and I'm not going to talk about art or culture or Hollywood or any of those other influences. One interesting thing is that during the Revolutionary War, royalty was dirt. Royalty was mud. You can read the way people wrote about it and thought about it. I'm not talking about the 1/3 who didn't want the war, but in general, royalty was kind of a joke to these people. Then gradually, after the Civil War, Americans fell more and more in love with British royalty. I mean, you can't go into a supermarket without one of the royals on the cover. If it's not one, it's another. So Americans are now in this big love affair and have been for, I don't know, 50, 60 years with the royal family. That's not accidental. The news media didn't just wake up one day and say, gosh, people love the Brits. They just love British royalty. Let's start putting them on the cover of these papers because people are so in love with British royalty. It didn't work that way. It worked the opposite. And that's what you're still being bombarded with. And again, the I'm not inventing this by any means. I'm just sort of reminding you if it sort of fell behind in your thought pattern. Also, World War II, some of the things that they did accomplish were scaring the pants off of everybody about communism or fascism. This is kind of really the two sides of the same coin. And it began to lead us, it created a kind of patriotism, the bad kind of nationalism that led us into Korea and Vietnam, that at all costs we must stop communism. So that was a way of thinking then. Gradually that changed when that kind of wore out after the Vietnam War. Gradually, I mean, you can still find somebody who's 90 years old who's, you know, banging his fist about communism. But that had its shift. Civil rights picked up, and eventually the national security state. The national security state, my friends and I in the 9/11 movement, we knew pretty much from the start that that was coming because we knew that the plan for the new American century had already been written. So we knew that the whole security state thing was a scam. But, you know, that was like 1% of the population sort of really picked up on that right away. Now, since most people think that the 9/11 attacks were indeed either false, they knew that most people think that 9/11 was a false flag. I don't know how you couldn't, but anyway. What I'm getting at is I'm getting to sovereignty, where you've got now a new way of thinking where freedom and independence and sovereignty and nationalism have become questionable words. They're not so effective anymore if you use them. And that's a little scary to me because of my love of studies of the Revolutionary War, where freedom was a visceral thing that people really felt. They said, wow, this is cool. We used to have to do everything the king told us, and now we give him the bird and off we go. So nowadays, there is a paradigm shift that we are going through. And I think that that is an attempt to erode the concept of sovereignty, the concept of freedom and independence. And I want to very shortly turn this idea over to my guests, John and Emily, who can either go on and change the topic completely if they wish, but I did want to give this little introduction. I did mention to somebody, and I can't remember who it was, but it was a woman I was talking to on the phone about something else, and I don't know how this came up, but it was a thrill, because she said to me that the war on drugs, and she didn't know anything about monetary reform, she wasn't that interested. Anyway, she said the war on drugs is a war against sovereignty. These countries can become financially, Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, whatever it is, Mexico, these countries can gain a little financial independence if they sell drugs. Not like this, the CIA isn't selling them as well, and they aren't sold in the US, but she was convinced that the war on drugs is a war against financial independence. And since anybody acting, like Noriega, for example, anybody acting in a nationalistic way, claiming sovereignty for his own country, is a target, been a target for a long time. And we've spoken many times on this program about the 7 countries that Wesley Clark mentioned that were on the list because they were independent, sovereign, their own monetary system. They had to be taken out. So sovereignty is a concept that I love because it means standing up against the establishment, the mainstream media, and the deep state. So I think that's the main thing. And what we can talk about if we have time is how the deep state, the Anglo-American deep state, gets you to think what they want you to think. We've already talked about 9/11. That was easy. I would have thought it too if I'd believed in the story. But since I didn't fall for that for 1 second. So that's how they do it. They create wars, they create false flag attacks, they create monstrous disasters, which then change the way people think. And if some people are saying that 5G is the next step in changing the way people think, I say, why bother, since you've got everybody wrapped up in your little fist anyway? Why go to the trouble of doing it with whatever you call it? But
because we become completely commodified.
Then everybody becomes okay. So it's a sales technique.
They have the potential of doing what you call the voice of God within people's head with the 5G.
Okay, well, let's talk about that.
Well, I mean, we're talking about the challenges to sovereignty, but I think something that's very wonderful and amazing and new that's happening on this planet that's really hard to define in terms of history because we haven't seen it. We've seen this patriarchy that allows psychopaths to really rule us all by fear. But as this sort of I don't want to call it feminism, but a balance comes in as the feminine wisdom is becoming more and more important, where we're thinking about not economies of competition or the best one win out, but we're thinking of economies of nurturing. So we're thinking about sovereignty in terms of health and happiness and well-being. And there's a lovely quote that maybe John will read in a minute. But one of the things that when we want to approach sovereignty, and you spoke about how all the wars are a means of controlling and changing concepts, and how people are really susceptible to fear. Because we haven't had the educative background to understand the metaphysics of our reality. We've always been taught about matter. This is it. We stop here. We don't have any backing in understanding ourselves as energetic human beings. So moving forward, I think specifically what the divine feminine is bringing forward is ability to work in those esoteric realms, which really removes that element of being able to be manipulated by fear. And that, I think, is a whole new frontier for us. But I'm going to ask if you'll read that. I pulled it up. It's this Neil Kramer's, he's got The Spirit of Sovereignty, and it's a wonderful quote that we've been reviewing and using lately.
Right. So before I read it, what's very interesting about this issue of sovereignty is that when the king is the sovereign, that's one person. Now the king, however the king views himself, he knows that he's responsible for the welfare of his kingdom. He's also concerned about his succession and about his standing and all these things. But it's one person. And the whole idea of the sovereign king is that now the relationship to God, God made him the king by by the accident of his birth. Oh, not the accident, the God-given right to rule. That idea of the mediation between the king and God, or the creator, is the key to the whole thing. We need to give our fealty to the king so that the gods will smile on us, so to speak. Now, the interesting thing that happens in the American Revolution, or leading up to the American Revolution, is the experience of the king didn't help us create this. The king is trying to mess it up. We created this. That's the key. So there's these two elements. The sovereignty goes back to our immediate individual connection to however we understand the creator, or the power behind the world, whatever it is that's creating the order or the situation that we're in. So that's the one aspect. Now, if we pass the sovereignty from the king to the people, everything depends on the individual experiencing himself or herself as sovereign and willing to enter into relationship with all the other sovereigns on that basis.
Well,
So-
not only willing to enter into is what happens when you have the idea of a king and subjects, and then we become the king or queen of, and everybody else is a subject. What happens to the person who wants to step into sovereignty is they really quickly realize that their sovereignty has no value without everybody else being sovereign.
Right, yes. So let's look at the spiritual aspect of sovereignty for a minute. And Emily and I both particularly like this quote by Neil Kramer. For a growing number of people focusing on matters of consciousness, sacred knowledge, and personal freedom, the reclamation of the word sovereign has become profoundly consequential. Within this paradigm, to recognize oneself as a sovereign being is to acknowledge one's own total spiritual autonomy and unconditional entitlement to self-determination. It is a primary avowal of oneself as a free and natural human being, not a serf, not a subject, a corporate entity, or even a citizen. No persons or man-made laws have any jurisdiction whatsoever over a sovereign being. This is all very alarming for any empire that secretly prefers its populace to feel toothless. So the interesting thing about this problem of sovereignty is that if I regard everyone else as sovereign, then I am very interested in the animating spirit, what it is that animates them. What is it that they feel called by their spirit, by their relationship to the spirit, to do in the world? And the most interesting thing is that when anybody is clear about what their mission in life is, they are motivated. Now, the culture has created a situation in which it's very difficult to do what you love and earn the money you need to live.
Yeah.
So the key to the whole issue of sovereignty is to stop issuing the money as debt, which people who've watched the show before know about, right? But rather to issue the money so that people have the money to live. If you have the money so that you can live, then you are genuinely at liberty, life, liberty, to pursue happiness. What is the only thing that ever makes you truly happy? Being able to accomplish your mission
Right.
in life, to serve the transcendent purpose that motivates you with the opportunity to develop your capacity to do it increasingly well, autonomously, the way you want to do it. That's the mark of the sovereign.
Yeah,
Now,
yeah.
If I'm in a position, right, to relate to you who's doing that, and to you who's doing that, then all I'm interested in is what do I need to do to help you achieve your life's purpose? What do I need to do for you? And we're all looking at each other that way. And the world that we create as a result of that attitude, that paradigm shift, is the better world that we all know in our hearts is possible.
So we're walking around, you know, all of us, and we go and we see people every day, people working in the grocery markets or people, young people working here and there. And there's this sadness and this yearning that they may be empowered. Because it's like the difference between reading a Richie Rich comic book and reading Tolkien or something. You know, we know that there's a depth of creativity and uniqueness within each person that's being suppressed.
Yeah.
Now, where I want to bring up is the potential of even more than the governor, even more than other portions of our elected government, the treasurer has the potential to give us many more tools of sovereignty. Then, and I think that hopefully that people will begin to ask of a treasurer much more than they do right now. Right now, it's supposed to, you know, keep everything kind of as it's going, keeping the status quo and not sinking the ship.
Getting the best interest rate you can, and
Right, right. So in this metaphor, we need the ship to have lifeboats to go out and explore other fishing waters, if you will, because the treasurer has the capacity, for example, to institute the common good payment system, which is entirely constitutional, and would double our money supply. And you can talk about that or have a whole show on the common good, or the treasurer certainly could see that we make certain that taxes go down, and we public bank, of course. And if we can ask the people of Vermont to begin to expect much more from their treasurer, then we could have the financial capacity to create the freedom and to make sure that we do not have to have have-nots for the haves to feel complete, because that's you must recognize as a sickness. You know, having everybody having enough and being completely unique is the thrill here.
and not to be
Yeah.
confused with what people think of as anarchy, because there is a thing called the tyranny of the majority, which is very real. It's the majority that's forcing your kids to get vaccinated. It's you know, they're buying into the CDC.
Well, I mean, we spoke
Right.
about this. All you have to do is say, well, vaccines, they're immune from lawsuits. And John, on the road on the way, well, that should tell everybody all they need to know.
It's all
Well, it should, shouldn't it? I mean, think of all the things out there that ought to tell everybody, that are telling everybody all they need to know, and
Yeah.
and people
Well,
just
There's
Right,
different
so-
levels.
so
There's different, and I'll hand it over to you in a second, but there's different levels, which is that there's the silence, even though you understand behind the silence, you recognize that it would jeopardize your work, your family relationships. So you're silent, but you recognize it, but you can't pass through that, invisible veil. So there, I think I sense there's a lot more people that defend the status quo in a way that isn't really loyal to it.
It's, it's a psychological need to defend the status quo in most people. I'm convinced of that. At least because of the way they think.
Yeah, well, there's so many pieces to this, but perhaps the way to get at it is that the only time that we're actually, every single one of us is actually in a position to exercise our sovereignty is that moment when we recognize that we don't have to think the thought that the popular culture provides. And the reason is that there is a gap between the percept, the experience that your body gives you, that comes to you from the world, and the way that you interpret that, right? So when we watched the 9/11, we watched the Twin Towers come down in a controlled demolition, and that was really hard to comprehend. When we know what we saw. We saw a controlled demolition. We really did. We watched it come down in a controlled demolition into its own footprint. But the concept to see that was coming from the coverage didn't allow you to think that. You had to get yourself to a place where you could use an interpretation that was an accurate concept for what you actually saw. That's the situation that we're in. We need to claim back our ability to stop the ready-made concept from the culture from giving us the interpretation that they want. And we need to choose the interpretation that best corresponds to the experience and gives us the most joy. That is the nature of individual sovereignty. And when we do that, and when we help each other to do that, then we begin to create a sovereign community. And I want to take it just that little step further. Jim and myself and Emily are involved in an effort to create the Republic. And the reason is that our life experience tells us that if we're going to change something, it's not by fighting the existing system. If we want to change something, we have to create the new model, the new way of doing things that's just so much better it makes the existing system obsolete. And that's the motto of the United
Republic.
States of America Republic that we're involved with. The motto is the quote by our Buckminster Fuller. To change them, you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. We are very, very focused on helping people to appreciate the extent to which the Neil Kramer quote is true. Your sovereignty proceeds from your ability to determine yourself how you are going to interpret the experiences that you have. And to encourage each other to do that.
Well, I do want to bring back sort of the nurturing component or the angle that, so often was segregated. The women talked amongst the women, the men talked with. But now that we're merging more and we're talking about how we're going to get to a republic that we never had. I mean, we never really have had an appropriately acting republic because of the way it was sidetracked. And you historians can talk about that better. But the way that translates to our activist friends who are working, it's essentially that we do need to be operating from the point of view that we have people's assemblies or wards where everybody's voice is heard, and from there the power is arisen, instead of electing celebrity people who use statutes and so forth. So we need to begin the power coming up from each other in what you will call warred republics. But back to the place of creating sovereignty, when we're talking about these intellectual concepts of math and war and thoughts, and remember, the written word is the domain of the male mind, that everybody's has male and female in them, but nonetheless. So if we're also thinking about, or at least allowing our feeling state, as we come to understand that there's decisions that are made by our liver, by our heart, they are actually organs that make decisions, that we begin to qualify and quantify our life experience according to how we're feeling, and whether we feel well, whether we feel inspired, whether we feel happy, and that bringing that component in to this experiment with, we got to not have to think along the concepts. We can simply also begin to look at the nature of our own personal reality and say, how am I feeling about it? Am I feeling inspired by the options that society is giving me? Am I feeling, never mind the whole nurturing problem, which is, why would you want to be violent in the first place? And that seems to be such a fascination of so many people that they can't, that it seems like they can't comprehend what would be fascinating about not being violent. What is there interesting to do then?
Yeah. I have a good friend in the monetary reform movement, Carmine Gorga, and he points out that men are intellectual. They want to solve the problem by thinking it through. But women are relational. They want to solve the problem by nurturing everyone. So at the moment that we're sitting in a circle, and the women are there, and the men are there, and the women are appreciating the power of the intellect, and the men are appreciating the power of the relationship, which, believe me, they do, then we have those two sides. At the moment that the question is, what would be good for you? Right? And I'm not trying to figure out how to fix your problem, right? But I'm asking, what would be good for you? What do you need? What are we in a position to do so that you can come to full expression?
Right.
Then you have this amazing experience of, we're all sovereign. And the thing that's most important to us is to put everybody in a position to come to full expression. The world that would result from encouraging, my mother, during the time that I was a child, was always very interested in what I wanted to do, not in telling me what I ought to be doing. Every once in a while she would get concerned that I might want to do drugs or something, but or drive too fast, or don't get so many tickets. but for the most part, I grew up in an atmosphere where both my parents were interested in what did I want to do, what did I want to become. It's an amazing experience. If the culture were based on that, because of this understanding of how important that connection to spirit is, even if you're an atheist to your humanity. I'm not trying to say that you have to be religious. I'm trying to say that we have an innate capacity to listen to ourselves and to learn how to think with our hearts.
Mm-hmm. So the whole institution of compliance-based learning, if as much of that as we can chuck out the window, little pieces of it, that's excellent, where we can do that and inspire a belief in everybody that their learning is eternal. Learning is the joy of life, really. And it's such a hardship on people who've been brainwashed or led to a belief that they don't have the capacity to learn, you know, or the ADHD kid, the kid we were talking about, who can't sit still, and there's no room in our existing system to take him
let him
outside. Yeah, let him
Let him go. What are you
Right.
doing?
Yeah, yeah.
And I had a series of events which we called Imagining Community. And one of the people in the group said, well, I don't know what my life's mission was. Everybody in the circle wanted to help him figure it out. I mean, really, that's what we want to do. We want to help each other to get to that relationship to our spirit, to our animating spirit, that enables us to experience genuine sovereignty. And if our society is based on the idea that we can actually encourage each other to act out of initiative, that's where the real power comes from. It's when I see what it is that my community wants or needs that I could do, that my background, my education, my skills, my interests lead me to be able to do. And all of a sudden, I don't need an alarm clock to get up in the morning.
Yeah.
I'm jumping out of bed, ready to go.
Yeah, well-
Because that's what we're after.
But-
And the colonials during the revolution, during the lead up to the revolutionary period, they were amazed themselves at how much they were able to accomplish. From 1730 to 1760, the American colonies grew their economy to rival England's.
Right.
And it was simply because there was always enough money. It was being issued as colonial scrip
Right.
by each of the states.
Right. So if we're just thinking of money as means of exchange, there's so many different options to do that, that the treasurer should do that. Now, we've also been talking, Jim, about the word power and the word force, which Neil Kramer brings up, about how when we've often talked that the powers that be, the powers that are, and instead, at least I am trying to get a discipline about talking about when money is used as force, and instead reclaiming the word power as the only power that really is that what some people call the Christ consciousness, is the sovereign consciousness, is the power of stepping into the excitement of seeing creativity and creation around you from a place of impeccable boundaries. I mean, it's really about doing no harm and impeccable boundaries.
And I've got a quote for you from Humphrey Bogart. He said, "The reason that money is so great is you don't have to do what some asshole tells you to do."
That's right.
And there's sovereignty,
Absolutely.
at least financial.
Yeah. So
I was wondering if you would venture into one of the thoughts that we've all gone into for many years, which is what stops some of these high-end academics, PhDs, from opening their minds to even looking at the truth of 9/11. I mean, I've had several answers come to me over the years, and I've read several answers to that question. And it's, I think from what you've said about sovereignty, that you probably have a pretty good answer to that. And there's one quote that explains it, which is, it's very difficult to persuade somebody to look at something when his paycheck depends on him not looking at it.
Yep.
So that, I think, has an awful lot to do with it. But we've got 6 minutes left. I'll turn that question over.
Our 9/11 Truth Group spent a lot of time on this. It was really important to us to figure out how to broach the subject so that people would be able to free up their minds. Now, the concept that you need to understand it is called cognitive dissonance. And if your life is based on being a professional or an academic, maintaining the existing system, and you see something that totally challenges that entire paradigm, you have to tell yourself something that allows you to continue. So that it's a little bit of the paycheck thing. I mean, if I go out and buy a sports car, I'm going to, when I don't need one and there's not enough room in the back seat for my kids and my wife's upset with me or what have you, I'm going to have to come up with some rationale that, that's my opinion and I'm sticking to it and that's why I did it and like it or lump it. It's sort of a psychological necessity if you're weak, if you're essentially weak. So what has the educational system done to us? And I'll tell a personal story because it's important to understand the significance of this. I had to take a social studies course in college. It was a requirement, and I don't know, I picked urban planning. And I'm in this urban planning class, and I'm listening to all this stuff, and it occurs to me that cities are designed so you don't know who your neighbor is. They're designed that way. The city is designed so you
Exactly.
don't know who your neighbor. And I raised my hand and I raised the question. It's a lecture course, right? There are almost 100 people in the room, and it burst out. There was a buzz. We started talking about why are cities designed so that you don't know who your neighbor is.
Yeah.
And the professor was excited that there was all this enthusiasm and all this. And the next class, he proceeds as though nothing had happened. So I raised my hand. He says, no, we got to get through the course material or you don't pass.
Yeah, that's
At
compliance.
that moment, I said to myself, oh my God, if I stay in college, I'm in danger of becoming indurated, of accepting a profoundly sick society.
Yeah.
And I happened to discover the Krishnamurti quote that I've lived by ever since. It is no sign of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. I do not ever want to be well adjusted to all the injustice that's all around me. And the last thing, the way that you get to people who are dealing with the cognitive dissonance is through justice. Everybody knows what's just. Everybody has a sense for what would be just. And if you ask them to consider that 9/11 was an inside job and it was, the basis for elevating terrorism and all the rest of that stuff, the cognitive dissonance makes it very hard to get through it. If you raise the question of what would a just and sustainable society be like, what would be necessary for us to have a just and sustainable abundance, everybody has a good idea. And the reason is that we all have a sense for the ideal social future. You could say that somewhere the universe is saying this to us. There is a just and sustainable abundance as soon as we experience ourselves as genuinely sovereign and responsible for creating it together.
1 minute.
Remember we were talking on the way up about occult memes.
Yeah.
And I said, how is an occult meme created? And you said through ritual. And so now you just spoke of this class you were in where the teacher had a ritual
That's right.
to get through, or the media has a ritual to say, oh my God, this, and they aren't doing their due diligence for investigation. I mean, they would have noticed that they started carting off evidence right away, instead of, cordoning it off like they would any other crime scene, so to get the evidence. So I don't think we've answered that question, but I
Well,
do
we
hope-
started to. That was
See-
thankful. Thank
Yeah.
you. That was good.
You see, the thing about ritual is that everybody participates. The Super Bowl halftime show is a ritual in which a huge percentage of the population
great
actually
this year.
participates.
I loved it.
And if you watch the occult themes in the Super Bowl halftime, you'll understand how that works
There
subliminally.
weren't so many this year. It was awesome. The women powered. There was a big woman.
Oh, I didn't
It
watch
was
it.
great this year. I loved it.
Well, thank you
Thank you,
everyone
Jim.
for watching.
you, Jim.
Thank you, Emily Payton and John Root. And this is Jim Hogue for the House at Pooh Corner. And there will be a philosophical follow-up, can you believe it, on this theme. Bye-bye.